Folks, thanks for coming along on this hot summer night to hear Tom McIlroy talk about his book, Blue Poles, Jackson Pollock, Gough Whitlam and the Painting That Changed a Nation. And today we've called it Jackson Pollock, The Blue Poles Controversy and the Whitlam Labor Government. Now, Tom will be well known to you as a political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review, and now the author of this book. And Tom, for a first appearance at the Sydney Institute, you're very welcome.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Gerard. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you tonight. I've read Gerard's column for my entire career as a journalist and his blog, and I've been name-checked in the blog a couple of times, I must confess. And I commend to you his books, including on Cardinal Pell and his biography of my grandfather, B.A. Santa Maria. I think your column must be one of the longest running in Australian newspapers, Gerard. I was on holidays at Mornington in Victoria when Gerard first approached me about speaking to Institute members. And Gerard remembered my grandfather riding on the beach at Mornington over summer, something I can clearly picture in my mind from long summer days in the beach box. And as a aside, there'll be a bit more on B.A. Santa Maria later, surprising in a speech about blue poles. And of course, Anne Henderson, thank you for the invitation to be here, Anne. I very much enjoy your biography of Joseph Lyons and your other writing. I think it's important scholarship, and I'm delighted to meet you tonight. In an indirect way, the story of blue poles, the Jackson Pollock painting purchased by the Whitlam government for Australia for $1.4 million back in 1973, has its origins in an unlikely place, the coalition government led by Sir Robert Menzies. While he was Prime Minister, Menzies moved to accelerate the relocation of public servants and government departments from Sydney and Melbourne to Canberra. Despite the plan designed by Walter Burley Griffin and decades of development, Canberra was still aspiring to be a true national capital, and the Canberra project as it was could easily have run out of political steam. The Depression and the war years had stifled spending, but Menzies was determined to finish the job. He established the National Capital Development Commission in 1957, and soon thereafter, departments, including the Department of Defence, were relocated along with their public servants. Menzies also overcame internal opposition over the cost of important elements of the national capital, including construction of Lake Burley Griffin. He insisted that it would be funded, and it was completed in 1974 and ties together the central part of the city. Under Menzies in 1955, the Department of the Interior had started to consider sites for a national gallery to be built somewhere in the capital's central triangle. A public appeal for funds was considered in the 1960s, and later a gallery proposal was considered for Capitol Hill, as envisaged by the original Griffin plan. Of course, that site was actually chosen for the new Parliament House. Cabinet signed on to a formal plan for the gallery in May 1965. Sir Darrell Lindsay was chosen to lead a public inquiry about its design and scope, and he reported to Harold Holt in March 1966. His report called for the creation of an institution to be known as the Australian National Gallery, and its contents to be called the National Collection. It was only in the 1990s, under the then director Betty Churcher, that the name was changed to the National Gallery of Australia, to bring it in line with similar institutions overseas. The Lindsay report imagined a gallery a lot like the institution that I'm sure many of you will have visited. It called for a broad-based collection and recommended historic works by Australian painters of all schools, as well as Indigenous art, art of Australia's neighbours in the region, and for new forms of art to be represented. When John Gorton was Prime Minister in April 1970, the federal government approved a 2-hectare site next to the lake for construction of the gallery. Gorton and his cabinet were aware that the national capital needed national institutions to shake off its reputation of being remote and sometimes lifeless. How well they did that is still debated today, I think. The following year, Gorton's successor, William McMahon, used a speech in Parliament to name the 40-year-old James Mollison as the acting director of the National Gallery. The appointment was recognition of what Mollison was already performing, of work Mollison was already performing unofficially from within the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Mollison was quite brilliant, and to many observers, he was quite a character. As I recount in the book, McMahon said years later that he'd picked Mollison on the advice of his wife, Lady Sonia McMahon, who had raved about the Melbourne-born Mollison's vast knowledge of the art world and his clear personal charm. Sir William even went further, saying publicly that he wanted Mollison to have the job because of his unmatched ability and international outlook. He's very good looking, he dresses well, he never gets excited and starts to shriek. He's not an extrovert, but he's perfectly normal, McMahon said of Mollison. Imagine a Prime Minister speaking about a government appointment like that today. So it's the coalition who put in place the man who did more than anyone, I would argue, to secure this monumental painting for Australia. Judith Pugh is shaking her head as I say that. He had been director of the Ballarat Fine Art Gallery, but in Canberra he believed a national institution should draw many people to it. Mollison was soon dubbed the man with the golden wallet and bragged that some days his morning mail in the development years of the gallery often included potential purchases worth as much as $50 million. Between 1964 and 1966, Mollison had been a director of Gallery A, the celebrated commercial collection. After he became a well-established figure in the public arts world, friends conceded that he wasn't very good at that job, working in a commercial gallery and trying to convince collectors to part with large sums of money. He actively prevented customers from buying flashy paintings they really wanted, one person admitted to the Australian magazine in 1976. He would have lost his self-respect, and he knew the paintings would be unloaded anyway after a year of empty boredom. Once appointed to the gallery, Mollison started a worldwide search for great art, promising a collection that would educate and entertain new audiences from across the country. He nominated Michelangelo as his favourite sculptor, Titian as his favourite painter, and he told an American reporter that his favourite artwork was the Renaissance great's Rape of Europa in the collection of Boston's famed Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Mollison liked Brahms, the Rolling Stones, and the TV soap opera Number 96. I'm too young to know that one, I must admit. After 4 years of working for Liberal Prime Ministers, along with the rest of the country, Mollison rode the cultural wave that was the 1972 election campaign. Gough Whitlam came to power in December that year. The It's Time election campaign would end nearly a quarter of a century of Conservative governments in Australia and prompt a journey to a different kind of cultural maturity in Australia. Labor had committed to promoting excellence in the arts, encouraged by people in the room tonight, and worked to widen access and understanding of culture across the community to help develop and promote Australia's cultural identity here at home and beyond. By the time of Labor's first federal budget, Mollison's annual allocation for acquisitions for the gallery increased from about $1.7 million to $4 million, a huge sum in that time, giving the gallery wide scope to buy landmark works. His policy for early purchases was that they should set the standard for future acquisitions in the modern period. I think if you go to the gallery today, that comes true. In 1972, the coalition government had been badly unsettled under McMahon. In the 6 years since Sir Robert Menzies had retired, the government had lost one Prime Minister to drowning, then cycled through a caretaker leader and months of bitter leadership struggles. Of course, cultivating in a party room challenge that resulted in Gorton being ousted and McMahon becoming the 20th Prime Minister. Labor knew that December 1972 was its best chance at ending 23 years of coalition government. McMahon was unpopular, and propped up by unreliable partners, he appeared out of step with the country that was changing on a near daily basis. Spectrum, a research firm that had helped pioneer the use of focus groups in Australian politics, conducted detailed analysis of voter sentiment in the 2 years leading up to that famous election. They found that whichever issue punters were asked to weigh in on, regardless of the demographics, the overall sentiment that was recorded was, quote, "It's time for a change." After advice from executives at an international advertising firm and detailed testing with some 1,100 people, Labor embraced the message, "It's time," and the slogan became a rallying cry. It was a mobilising phrase designed to tap into this underlying frustration and the push for change that existed in parts of the community. Whitlam himself said the slogan reflected the prevailing mood of the country with rare accuracy. In a modern and exciting campaign pitch by newspaper proprietors, business figures, journalists and celebrities, Whitlam and Labor set the standard for election campaign slogans for decades to come. On December 2, as history shows, they were brought to office with a swing. Whitlam turned to his confidant Graham Frodenberg and said, "I think we're in." Labor won office with 52.7% of the two-party preferred vote and 67 seats in the 125-member House of Representatives. This is an amazing fact. It would be the first time since the Great Depression that Labor had formed a new government after an electoral victory, and the first time Australians had seen the transfer of power between the two major parties since 1949. Of course, the new government would prove to be a boon for the arts in Australia. Lobbied by many interested parties, Whitlam believed it was an area sorely in need of attention and stimulus, lamenting that many of the country's best artists and writers were living overseas at the time. He said the national cultural institutions were embryonic or non-existent, and nowhere was it clearer than in the country's capital. As an aside, I think it's interesting to reflect that Whitlam, perhaps more than any other Prime Minister, had a keen understanding of Canberra's strengths and weaknesses. His father, Fred Whitlam, had been appointed as the Assistant Crown Solicitor in 1927, and along with his wife and an 11-year-old son, Goff, and his younger sister, Frida, they joined the public service migration to this newly established city. The family lived close to Parliament House, and Whitlam accompanied his father to the Australian War Memorial site to see the Governor-General, Lord Stonehaven, lay the foundation stone on Anzac Day 1929. Some 40 years later, the historic memorial would be among the collections found to be in need of urgent attention and new funding from the Whitlam government. Whitlam would name Canberra, the city, as one of the three great influences on his life, along with the 1944 referendum campaign of the so-called 14 Powers and his war service in the Pacific. Such was his commitment to the arts that Whitlam nominated widening access across the community as a priority for his It's Time campaign speech before the election. While the establishment of a national gallery had long been expected, he said his government would be the government to do it, and that they would help establish a new Australian identity through the arts. He received a rock star reception at the Blacktown Civic Centre that night. But, as history shows, once in power, Labor faced a deteriorating economy, the threat of rising inflation, and tough times for households around the country. Rising prices, increased job insecurity, and the ability of the government to stem inflation were all limited. Oil price shocks hit economies around the world, just as the unemployment rate here at home started to rise. Averaging less than 2% between 1966, when Holt replaced Menzies, and Labor's arrival in office in 1972, sustained increases saw the jobless rate reach 6% between 1973 and 1981. Going from about 4,000 to 80,000, the number of long-term unemployed people increased in the period. Unemployment eventually peaked at 6%, inflation rose to 18% in 1975. Among the bold economic moves of the government's first year was Whitlam's decision to institute a 25% cut to tariffs across the economy in a bid to boost imports from overseas. My paper, the Australian Financial Review, called this, quote, undeniably one of the most forthright and courageous economic decisions taken by any Australian government. The recommendation of a specifically established advisory committee through the recommendation of that committee, the tariff cut had frustrated Treasury officials and angered manufacturers and farmers around the country. Author and academic Clem Lloyd described Whitlam's parliamentary performance in that time of having an aura of borrowed time and consequent haste. It's in this environment in June 1973 that Max Hutchison, a gallerist and James Mollison's mate in New York, wrote to Canberra to say that there was a Jackson Pollock painting for sale. He wrote, "Blue poles available at $2 million US, with the painting retained in the USA for 1 year." The cable to James Mollison exists today in the National Archives of Australia. Quote, "Painting is in magnificent condition." Hutchison had tracked the negotiations between the private owner, Ben Heller, a rich Manhattan businessman, and an unnamed museum for a possible sale, and eventually decided that Australia had an opportunity to strike. And as history shows, and we recount in the book, Mollison was determined to buy the picture. A special meeting of the Gallery Acquisitions Committee was called for the following week. Mollison told the group that no work of contemporary art of such importance had ever been offered to an Australian institution to that time. He said Blue Poles was Jackson Pollock's magnum opus, and that the sale would be on par with the Matisse masterpiece, The Dance in Russia. Expert appraisals were commissioned, and a Metropolitan Museum of Art curator from New York backed the purchase, writing, "I think it could be said that Blue Poles is the most important post-work American painting still held in private hands. Its addition to your collection would make a trip to Australia mandatory for anyone interested in the total achievement of the arts in the past 30 years, the curator wrote. A briefing paper was promptly drafted by Brendan Kelson, then the gallery manager and leading this committee. Whitlam was told that the group of experts believed there was little question that the government had a chance to buy truly one of the great paintings of the 20th century, a work that was both monumental in conception and proportion. Amid careful bureaucratic language, Kelson's advice suddenly struck on something much larger than just the decision about the expenditure of public money. It was a delight to pick up this piece of paper and read the words. He told Whitlam that his choice represented a moment in Australian art history and potentially the first chapter in the story of the Australian National Gallery. Whether or not the government decided to buy Blue Poles, Kelson said, "The fact that it was offered to Australia will be recorded in the literature of art of the mid-20th century." Acknowledging the cost was high, the committee told Whitlam that the dollars and cents should be secondary to the likely effect the decision would have on art in Australia. Mollison suggested quickly any specific reference to the price paid for the work, nearly $1.4 million, should be kept secret. He said revealing the price that was potentially going to be paid would risk making the gallery a pace setter and could see a premium attached to any price for any work considered thereafter for the national collection. Presciently, Mollison also warned that the revelation of a monumental price for the work risked affecting the view the public held of Blue Poles before consideration of the painting's artistic importance. Another issue was that highly priced and publicised works of art around the country had a habit of attracting, quote, militant minorities or persons who are mentally disturbed. The committee's advice was for the speedy purchase of the painting, knowing that the budget rules and something called the Treasurer's Advance could be used. They said that a ministerial announcement about the painting should be withheld until it arrived here in Australia. History shows that none of that came true. Despite the political challenges that Whitlam was facing and a myriad of other decisions that he had to make on the same day, in a decision that would see him dubbed the Medici of the Monero, he wrote a single instruction at the bottom of the briefing paper. "Buy it," he said, and disclose the price. I can see some consternation from Judith tonight. In August 1973, Australian Financial Review journalist Terry Ingram got word of the Blue Poles purchase and worked hard to break the news on the front page of the August 20 edition. He called the gallery press office on a Sunday afternoon, hoping that his message on the answering machine would go unanswered until the next day's newspaper was already being read on breakfast tables around the country. Half a century later, Ingram, who went on to write the sales room column for the Fin for a very long time, refused to reveal his source for this story. I tried a few creative approaches to try and get him to tell me who had told him about blue poles, without any luck. All he would say was that they were not connected with the world of fine arts. One colleague in Canberra speculated to me yesterday that this might have meant that the tip came from someone at the Reserve Bank. At that time, the Reserve Bank would have been required to approve such a big purchase and transfer of money to the United States. Whitlam was soon asked about blue poles. He described Pollock as one of the great figures in modern American art and said that the painting was regarded as his masterpiece. He confirmed that he'd known of the proposal and authorised it, as well as the price being made public. Whitlam said it was not his place to overrule the Expert Acquisition Committee's recommendation, noting that once the legislation, long delayed, for the establishment of the gallery as a standalone entity had passed Parliament, it would have full authority to spend its budget without ministerial approval. In a press conference at Old Parliament House, he ended an answer defending the blue poles purchase with a joke. He said, "I know this is quite a contribution in overseas aid to redress the American adverse balance of payments with Australia." In question time, Country Party MPs raised the purchase with Whitlam and his ministers. Whitlam said, "If Australian galleries were limited by the comprehension of those opposite, they would be very bare and archaic indeed." Historian Jenny Hocking says that Whitlam enjoyed the aggressive denunciations that followed the blue poles purchase, which he viewed as a welcome distraction from the anguish of the stymied program and animosities he and his ministers were facing in Canberra. It's clear looking back at the historical record that Whitlam had a fluency and understanding of art that outstripped some of his critics and critics of the purchase. He clearly enjoyed the fight over blue poles. He and Margaret famously put an image of the painting on their Christmas card in December 1973, replacing what had traditionally been a religious image. Margaret Whitlam also continued the tradition long after the couple left the lodge. Someone showed me a Christmas card from 1984 with blue poles on it as well. Of course, history shows that Whitlam lost control of the politics of the era and was sensationally removed from office in 1975. As a quick aside, please let me tell you that this afternoon I had the call that any author of a new book dreads. Our host called and said that he'd found a problem with the book. I'm sure everyone here knows that Gerard's forensic knowledge of history has tripped up more than one or two hacks over the years. I was very worried. Writing about the loans affair and the general deterioration in the government's political standing, I write in the book that a Treasury official at the time had been in regular contact with Malcolm Fraser about the behind-the-scenes drama that was playing out in the department as the budget supply bills were stuck in Parliament. The man used the code name Mr. Williams. What I didn't know until our phone call this afternoon was that Mr. Williams was in fact my grandfather, Bob Santamaria. And I was stunned to learn this. I knew that he'd published under that name, but I hadn't made the connection. So thank you, Gerard. I must say, I had wondered what his views would have been of blue poles. The Australian art critic Robert Hughes was one of those who argued that blue poles had contributed to the political chaos that was engulfing the government and really engulfing the country. He argued that it contributed to the end of the Whitlam government in the dismissal in November 1975. Hughes believed that claims that the painting had been bought for a steal had never washed with voters or the press, and he described the, quote, resulting hullabaloo over the expenditure of public money as part of the broader view that Labor was reckless and irresponsible in government. He said that bold moves and controversies like the loans affair were too much of a departure from political norms to be allowed to continue. Jenny Hocking also says debate about the price fed into a sense of economic irresponsibility and wasted public expenditure. I've tried to focus on the politics of the era and the development of the National Gallery in this address today, but the book has plenty of art history as well, including the main events of Pollock's life and the creation of the work in New York, in 1952-1953. It covers defence of the purchase by figures including Patrick White, the Nobel laureate, the various tabloid scandals and front page stories that were attached to blue poles at the time, including the disproven allegations that he painted it during a drunken binge with two mates, and many of the cultural products like plays and poems and even wine that have their foundation in blue poles. But I'll end where the book starts. A couple of weeks before Blue Poles was due to be winched out of the window of a 10th floor Manhattan apartment to begin its journey to Australia, a journalist asked the emeritus director of the Yale University Art Gallery, Andrew C. Ritchie, how he would react to news that a Pollock painting had been sold to Australia for almost $2 million US. "I'd drop dead," he said. Thank you, Gerard and Anne, and thank you to the audience for giving me the pleasure of addressing you tonight. It's been a thrill for me, including signing the book with so many important speakers. It's been a thrill just as it was learning about this incredible period in history, and I'm delighted that you'll have the opportunity to read the book. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Tom. As mentioned earlier, we've got copies of Blue Poles, Jackson Pollock, Gough Whitlam, and The Painting That Changed the Nation, and the author will be happy to sign some outside after, and we'll sell some online if we have any left. I just want to make one clarification. John Williams did ring Malcolm Fraser. He was your grandfather, but the person who gave the advice about what was happening in Treasury was someone else who I think we don't know. And I think Laurie Oakes confused the two. So John Williams rang up, that's for sure, but someone else rang up giving that advice. Bob Santamaria would have given advice, but of a different kind, I think. Thanks for tonight. Just to go back to what you were saying about the build-up of the purchase to the attitude to the Whitlam government about spending and whatever. And as you well know, what you were talking about was August 73. Whitlam wins a double dissolution election in May 74. And Blue Poles is not such an issue. You would have thought if it was going to be an issue, it would have been an issue in the first election after the purchase, not in the second.
Yeah, I think that's right. And from modern eyes, looking back at the quick succession of elections that the Whitlam government faced, it's surprising to see how the events play out. Sorry. I don't think it was a primary issue of concern to voters at the ballot box, but I think it was closely held by supporters of the Whitlam government, people who believed in cultural policy and the ambition that that government or the potential that it had. Equally, I think for critics of the government, it became a symbol that could be used against it as one of profligacy or irresponsibility. So I think it kind of split along those lines and contributes in a small way to the eventual political situation.
Tom, with 50 years of hindsight, do we have any sense of what the return on investment has been? And did any tourists actually come to Australia just to see Blue Poles?
It's a great question. In dollars and cents terms, the return on investment's probably never going to be exactly quantified, but it was purchased for about $1.4 million. I think that's adjusted with inflation about $14 million today, and the insurance valuation on Blue Poles is for $500 million. If it was sold for that price, it would be in the top one or two paintings ever sold. Of course, I don't think that'll ever happen. And as for tourists coming to Canberra, I've been overwhelmed by the amount of people who have told me about doing exactly that, coming as school kids, coming with their families to see the picture. And a number who say that they were disappointed by the rest of the National Gallery collection, but they saw that one painting that they knew. When it first arrives in Australia, because the gallery is still 10 years away at that point, the building anyway, it travels to all the state galleries, Brisbane, Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne. And there are civic receptions and parties for VIPs. I think in Brisbane at the Town Hall, you had to pay 20 cents to see Blue Poles, and the Lord Mayor hosted a party for all the city's glitterati. And just last week, the director of the National Gallery, Dr. Nick Mitchevitz, told me that some months ago, he was told that there was a VIP coming to Canberra to see Blue Poles, and he met this individual. He wouldn't tell me who it was. He said that the person had flown to Australia on a private jet. He asked them how long they were in Australia for. The man said about 45 minutes and motioned to the painting, and then went back to the airport and flew away again. So I think undoubtedly it's a bit of a magnet for Canberra and for the gallery.
Tom, Whitlam always gets the praise for Blue Poles, but it was really Mollison that was behind it all. So why is it that we don't talk about the man who chose or agreed to buy it, and always about Gough Whitlam? Is it just because Gough Whitlam's got the big name? I mean, I think it's rather sad, because what you described is that what was happening at the National Gallery goes right back into the era of the Liberal government, and it's really Mollison that changes the way we think. Although Gough Whitlam made a big splash about it, it wouldn't have happened without that director.
I think that's right, and I think clearly there were a lot of people advocating for the arts and pushing Labor to take up the arts as a clear cause, some who are here tonight, and pushing for big thinking. I think Mollison doesn't get the credit that he deserves, certainly he's not as well known as Gough. And I think there's a nice kind of synchronicity with Gough and the painting. They're both kind of larger than life and all-encompassing. But yeah, my theory is that Whitlam gets too much of the credit, and it was actually the careful advice and advocacy of people around him who pushed him. But in our system of government, usually praise and criticism rests at the top. And he certainly liked it as part of his legacy.
Betty Churcher, for example,
Yeah.
she got the credit later on.
Yeah.
Was it because the gallery wasn't an independent entity?
Possibly. It might be that the work of the committee wasn't particularly well known. They called Betty Churcher Blockbuster Betty because of the big exhibitions that she brought to Canberra. I think that's sort of part of the culture that people around Labor, the public servants involved, the government, Whitlam and his ministers kind of contributed to. And without making a political point, I think we still benefit a bit from that today. And I think definitely people come to Canberra sometimes for an art exhibition, sometimes to see a museum show or something like that. And for a city that gets a bit of a bad rap, I think we're stronger for it. I'm so delighted that Judith's here. We'd spoken on the phone once before, but not met until tonight. So thanks for coming, Judith.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and for a terrific book. I can recommend it. Everybody go and buy it. I enjoyed it thoroughly. It's beautifully written. I will say it now. I was going to say it to you afterwards, but Whitlam did not make the decision. He rang to ask advice from Cliff, my then husband, Clifton Pugh. And unfortunately, Cliff was out.
Wow.
And unfortunately, when he came back, he said, "Oh, no, I think that's a very bad idea." He said, "It'd be wonderful, wonderful painting to have, don't get me wrong, but the situation is so bad at the moment, it's so chaotic, I think it will just tip it over and it will not be a good decision to buy something so expensive." I said, "Well, I told him to buy it." And so, because... Do you mind if I go on slightly, Gerard?
Yes, on slightly.
Okay, sure. When I was 15 years old, my mother's best friend told my parents to send me to the National Gallery summer school, National Gallery Victoria summer school. And she came and got me out of the children's one, and I was taken to the grown-ups one, which is what she had intended. And for the first time saw a man without any clothes on. You had to draw him. And so at that time, Mary Cecil Allen, who was an Australian painter living in New York, lectured to us. Now, I'm 15. The grown-ups have huge pictures all about all of those painters. She was particularly involved with them, the New York School, and Pollock. When I met Cliff, I was 25. And there were these men who'd been major painters, John Brack, Fred Williams, Cliff, all great friends meeting. And so I never said a word about painting ever. I never made a remark. But when Whitlam rang me and said, I've never heard, oh no, I said, he said, a great painter, one of the greatest painters. Well, I don't think he's going to sign it. So Cliff comes in and says, oh God, I better ring him. He said to me, what do you know? And I said, well, and he rang and Whitlam said, I've just signed off on it.
Wow.
So he did actually seek advice from a political advice. No, well, it was an artist, but it was political advice. Cliff was very involved in the politics of the time. So there's
I'm amazed by that anecdote. Thank you. I wish I'd known before the book was published. Thank you. Yeah, I think he and perhaps modern prime ministers could take a page out of this. He did have contact with important figures in the arts at the time, and I think probably benefited from that advice. It's a wonderful story. Thank you. And of course, we know the links that persist in the Whitlam story. And of course, Mollison was maybe similar to you, Judith, had his foundation at the National Gallery here in Melbourne, National Gallery of Victoria. And as a child sort of was exposed to the arts and was really ahead of his years in that sense. I'm thrilled. Thank you for telling that story.
As someone who lived in Melbourne at the time and always read the Sun News Pictorial, I remember the story about Pollock being drunk, I think barefooted and drugged and whatever else, and you cover it in your book, but it sounds exciting. I mean, did he paint it drunk or did he paint it sober?
Well,
or a bit of each?
He didn't paint very much sober, I can tell you that much. He was a terrible drunk, and for the last more than 5 years of his life, he was pretty much, well, he was certainly an alcoholic and he was drunk much of the time. And of course, he died in a car crash when he was driving drunk and killed somebody else in the same accident. Part of my research, I went to the studio in Springs in New York, Long Island, and saw the room where he worked. And you can feel the emotion. He was a pretty angry bloke, and the alcohol didn't help, and he treated people atrociously. And I think in that room, it's an old barn that was converted, and the floor is covered in paint from Pollock's painting. I think you can feel that personality there. He was a pretty destructive guy.
But you argue that he didn't paint it drunk. I mean, how do you know that?
I think the historical record is properly corrected that incident. It was detailed in a magazine article in New York Magazine in the 70s. The allegation was that it was Pollock was sloshed one night, and two of his friends went to try and convince him that he needed to get off the booze and start painting again, and that the three of them created this painting together. That history is carefully told in the article in the magazine and then splashed by the tabloid papers here in this kind of dramatic way. But the people that were there at the time, including Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, and friends very close to Pollock, all say that the story is wrong and is not borne out by the evidence. And some of the analysis of the canvas itself don't match up with the story that's told there. So I think that story is wrong. But whether Pollock himself was drunk when he painted it alone, I don't know.
Do you think he would have been better if he was sober?
Well, I'm not sure. He was pretty good in those last few years. It's when he had his real breakthrough as an abstract expressionist.
Tom, did the painting come from nowhere, or did it develop from other paintings? I mean, did it just sort of happen like, he jumped on the board and we all have this notion that anyone could do a blue pole. Someone did a red poles as a joke along the line. But had this painting developed over time?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
It's a great question, Anne. Thank you. Just before Christmas, I was lucky enough to see an exhibition of Pollock's early works from his childhood all through the first stages of his career. And they're figurative drawings. Some of them are quite naive. There's paintings with people and houses and landscapes, just like any other artist. All through his career, he's searching for a kind of mould-breaking style of his own. He spends a few years poorly imitating his mentor, and then he tries to imitate Picasso and goes through all these different moulds. But eventually, in that last kind of 10-year period, when he's in his 30s and 40s, he pulls himself out of a depression and pushed along by Lee Krasner, his wife, starts experimenting with all these wild things. Drip painting, he called them all-over paintings, and I think Blue Poles is an all-over painting if you look at it. So it didn't come from nowhere. It came from a education in muralist works, like big picture works, and in different kinds of application of paint onto a canvas, including sticks and all kinds of stuff. And the last thing I'll say, if I'm not talking too long, the poles of Blue Poles, which you see front and centre in the work, actually have their DNA in the very start of Pollock's career. There's an artist who teaches him at an art school in New York called Thomas Hart Benton, and his method of teaching was to start with the structure of an artwork. And there are diagrams that he drew in the 1920s that include poles dividing the canvas. And Benton believed that they were invisible, that you could draw them on, but you would paint over them to orient the work. And for some reason, without any other particular warning, at the end of his life, end of his career, after Benton's influence is washing away, Pollock puts them on the front of the picture, and they kind of make it work as a picture, I think.
Thank you for the talk, and what I'd like to say is your personal response to Blue Poles. When you stand and you look at it, could you talk about that for us, plus the background that you did? And I want to mention, of course, Archie Moore and the Golden Lion Award, and how the world has come to see that work through the Venice Biennale and all the messages that it conveys. So that's just my little extra please, if I can.
I think that's a great point. And actually, if you go to the gallery today, Blue Poles is in the room next door, very close, and they're both monumental. My parents came up to Canberra at the weekend with my sisters, and we went and saw the painting. There's a new lighting system at the gallery, and the painting has been restored in the past, or conserved, cleaned in the past few years. So it's looking as good as it ever has. I can't remember the first time that I saw it, but I suspect I was a child. My aunt was a public servant in Canberra. We used to go and visit her, so I think that might have been when I first saw it. But every time I see it, I look at a different part of it. It's hard to find a single piece of the painting to kind of focus on, because it's so all-encompassing. And also, I mean, I made this point the other night, and I'm not sure if I should repeat it, but I'm not sure it's the most successful Pollock work. It's not, it's an amazing story and it's a brilliant thing, but there are a couple of other big drip paintings in collections in New York that I think are more successful. I think it's the top tier, but maybe not the number one. But I do love it. Clearly I love it. Yeah, it's in the subtitle of the book. Thanks.
I've got a question from one of our Zoomers in Hobart, who says that Tom says that it went to various galleries in the capital cities before it entered the National Library in Canberra, but what happened when it did enter the National Library in Canberra? Who was in government then, and what was the reception then?
It's a great question, and thank you to the viewers watching on the live stream. Fraser was Prime Minister when the gallery was eventually opened, and along with the Queen and the McMahons, the Whitlams were invited to the opening, and there's fantastic photos of them all standing around in the Brutalist Gallery building. The Queen is photographed with James Mollison walking past the painting, and I'm not sure it would have been her taste. I suspect probably not. But it's a bit of a unifying moment. She opened the gallery building and the High Court building in the same visit, and not that long after, or maybe 5 years later, was back to open Parliament House. So yeah, the gallery continued to prosper under Malcolm Fraser as Prime Minister, and James Mollison continued in the job. Eventually he moves to Melbourne and is the director of the National Gallery down there. And I might just say there were protests in Adelaide when Blue Poles was there, and when it was in Sydney, Paul Hogan, the actor, was photographed by the Daily Telegraph holding his nose and giving a thumbs down to Blue Poles. So it was a popular topic as well.
Well, this relates to another Zoomer question I have, which is, it just sort of follows that she's read your book, obviously, and says you got a chapter there about Philistines, and the question is it fair to blame everyone who, she's not saying you did it, but is it fair to blame everyone who was against Blue Poles as a Philistine, and where is Philistine?
It's not fair. It's not fair, certainly not. A lot of people, abstract expressionism kind of miffs a lot of people and doesn't. It's hard to grasp. You know, if you like landscapes or portraiture or sculpture or something, there's probably an access point that might be missing for an abstract work. The Philistines quote is James Mollison defending the Fraser government and insisting that he's able to do his job while they're in government as well. So no, I think it's unfair to say that anyone who doesn't like blue poles is a Philistine. I think that misunderstands what an art gallery is supposed to be about.
Yes.
Hi, I'm just wondering. Sorry, I was just wondering whether in your research you found any letters and correspondence. I know James Mollison and Lee Krasner were friends.
Yes.
And she helped validate blue poles on that committee you referred to. And I just wonder, in the archives, did you find any personal correspondence between the two of them?
Yes, James Mollison's papers are in the National Gallery archive and available for researchers, and they are voluminous. There's so many, and there's correspondence between him and Krasner about other pictures that are available, and other Pollocks were purchased for the National Collection. And I think you're exactly right. She believes in Mollison's vision, and she acknowledges the effect that blue poles had for Pollock globally. You know, set a record for his work and really restored him to the top tier of American artists. And I'm pretty sure my favourite interview in the whole process was with Pollock's nephew, Krasner's nephew as well, Jason McCoy, who's an art dealer in New York today in his 80s. And he was involved in this correspondence and knew Krasner well as a young adult and worked to manage the Pollock estate. And he says that Mollison is a giant of the arts world. And I think it goes to perhaps the earlier question that maybe he doesn't get enough recognition as an arts administrator and somebody who helped Australia grow up a bit in the arts. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to give my impression of the painting, because I was living in Canberra in the mid-80s, and every time I went to the National Gallery, I just sat there in front of it 5-10 minutes, and the dancing of the motion of it is just amazing. So for anybody needing to be convinced about modern art, go and look at blue poles.
I couldn't have put it better. I think it's really about energy and motion, and you really feel it. I had been told that there's a replica blue poles in the National Gallery building, and I asked someone recently if that was true. When they were moving in after the building was completed, they made scale replicas of some of the works to imagine where they would go on the walls. The staff painted them, a crude imitation, and it is today hanging in the staff dining room upstairs in the gallery. Mm-hmm. And you should see it. It's not as coherent as blue poles, but it's got that energy and motion. It's an amazing thing. Great question.
Getting close to the end, one of our Zoomers wants to ask about you. Where did you come from? I mean, do you do art history, he wonders, or are you just a journo in Canberra taking on a new task?
I hope that the questioner isn't one of my art history lecturers from the University of Melbourne, because I'm sure that those people would be surprised that I've written a book about a painting, because I was a very unsuccessful student of art history. I studied politics and I've mostly covered politics in my career, but I love the Canberra story and the kind of Canberra identity, and I really love art, and this story ties those threads together. So yeah, I grew up in Melbourne and was taken many times to the National Gallery of Victoria, and so I think, and my mum's a history teacher, I must say, so that's kind of where I've come from on this.
That's a good way to end.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Many thanks for tonight. It's a hot night. I just want to say congratulations. Great speech, great book, well done. Come back next time, something else.
Thank you, Gerard.